Picture this. A Chinese food delivery driver pulls up outside a vacant house in Queens, New York. It's late in September 2000, but the driver, also the owner of the business, wants every sale he can get. He's a father of two and wants to provide for their future. The order had come in normally enough through a call to the restaurant. The kitchen prepared the food, and Jin-Sheng Liu went on his way. He sits outside the vacant house and considers whether it's safe. Inside the car is about $60 worth of food, including General Tso's chicken, shrimp lo mein, and egg foo young. It smells good, and he doesn't want to disappoint the people who ordered. Police would later trace the cell phone used to place the order back to a group of teenagers who had lured the driver to the abandoned house intentionally. And Jin-Sheng Liu's family never saw him again. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of True Crime Culinary, the podcast where we look at the strange intersection of food, history, crime, and culture in bite-sized episodes every Thursday. And today's episode starts with a murder investigation in Queens and takes us through the culinary journey of, did you guess it? Cookies that doth tell you your future. So after today, if someone says, hey, what if we talked about homicide investigations, Japanese immigration, wartime politics, Chinese takeout, and tiny prophetic cookies in one bite-sized episode? You could totally respond and say, oh my God, you also listen to True Crime Culinary? And I imagined you'd have a snack together or, I don't know, maybe pet a dog. In all honesty, I don't remember what got me thinking about fortune cookies for this week's episode. But once I started looking into the history, I was like, damn, this is crazy. So let's crack open the story and read all about it. Let's start with, where do the cookies of fortune even come from? The modern fortune cookie is generally believed to descend from Japanese crackers called we're all going to appreciate the pronunciation together. Either Sujura Senbai with an N or Senbei, Sembei, depending on the source I saw. These cookies existed in Japan during the 1800s, particularly around Kyoto. They were different from the pale vanilla fortune cookies most people know now. That's because the cookies were a bit different. They had darker dough, sesame and miso flavoring, larger shape, and little fortunes tucked into the fold that were handwritten. The fortunes themselves came from older Japanese traditions involving written fortunes connected to temples and shrines. And from what I read, there were these little waffle-like irons where batter was pressed inside into a mold. You held that in the fire, and then while the cookie was still warm, you would tuck the message inside and fold the cookie in. That means the basic idea already existed long before the cookie showed up in American takeout bags. But when did it come to America? The concept likely arrived in California through Japanese immigrants sometime in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And one of the people most commonly associated with early fortune cookies is Makoto Hagiwara, who managed the Japanese tea garden in San Francisco. And if you haven't been to the Japanese tea garden, I highly recommend it. It's in Golden Gate Park, and it is a real gem. You feel hell peaceful walking through there, let me tell you. Last time I went was when my crew friends were in town, and I was reminded of how incredibly precious this place is. It's pristine, it's beautiful, it's calming, and sometimes there's a line to get in, which is, I would venture, just about the right amount of time to listen to episode 23, the Japanese siege that made cup noodle famous. I'm just saying it's a perfect journey. Historically, visitors at the tea garden were reportedly served versions of these cookies in the early 1900s. The transition from Japanese snack to Chinese restaurant staple happened largely during and after World War II. One major turning point was Pearl Harbor. And in case your historical reference point is primarily the Ben Affleck movie, and I want to say Matt Damon is in there. Basically, Japan bombed a U.S. naval base in Oahu, Hawaii in 1941. For anybody who doesn't really know where Hawaii is, imagine it's like halfway between Japan and California. Not 100% accurate, but sort of gives you a reference. It's out kind of in the middle of nowhere, aka the Pacific Ocean. Basically, there was a naval base out in Oahu, and Japan came and bombed it. The attack killed over 2,400 people and pushed the United States into World War II. Before that point, apparently the United States was a little more neutral, but once that happened in Pearl Harbor, it got pretty gruesome. Huge bummer all around. Then in 1942, after the attack, the old Presidente, Franklin D. Roosevelt, signed Executive Order 9066, And more than 120,000 Japanese Americans were incarcerated in internment camps across the United States during Japanese American internment. People were only allowed to bring what they could carry. Families were locked behind literal barbed wire for years just because they were Japanese. That meant their businesses closed, and families lost their property. Restaurants disappeared. Meanwhile, Chinese American restaurants continued operating and started including the cookies with meals. I also read that Chinese menus don't traditionally include dessert. And I'm not gonna lie, I did not realize that ahead of time. At the same time, many Americans did not distinguish carefully between Asian cuisines or cultures. And according to several sources, customers actively requested cookies. So by the late 1940s and 50s, fortune cookies had become increasingly associated with Chinese restaurants in America. The Japanese internment camps, I want to say, went for a few years, and so there was enough time for this change to really take hold. Fun fact, fortune cookies did not take off in China. I read they tried to market the cookies in China and local customers were basically like, no thank you, goodbye. So, fortune cookies are basically a Japanese-American invention that got absorbed into Chinese-American restaurant culture through wartime politics and restaurant economics. Bit of a mouthful, but accurate. Now, a couple details about fortune cookies and how they're made. I mentioned that originally fortune cookies were folded by hand, which sounds super charming until you imagine making 12,000 of these and how many little fire pits you would need with how many of those little irons. So they had to come up with a scalable solution. The cookie really scaled commercially after mechanized folding machines appeared in the mid-20th century. One major figure associated with this transition is Edward Louis, who developed automated machinery that could flatten the batter, insert the fortune, fold the cookie while hot, and cool it rapidly before it hardened. And that mattered because fortune cookies worked extremely well for restaurants because they're cheap, lightweight, shelf-stable, easy to distribute, and pretty memorable. Fun fact, I did look up how many calories are in one fortune cookie, and the answer is 30. Roughly the same as 1 cup of radishes. I'm here with all the helpful facts, people. Now, by the late 20th century, companies like Wonton Food Inc. were producing millions of cookies daily across North America. Millions. And eventually, the cookie became attached to the larger ecosystem of takeout culture. The full picture became paper bags, receipts, delivery orders, phone calls, plastic menus and kitchen drawers, and fortune cookies. All those items start to create records, which brings us back to the story in Queens. Back to September 1st, 2000. Someone places a Chinese food order to a vacant house in Queens. We remember our delivery driver, Jin-Sheng Liu, who immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s and eventually owned 2 Chinese restaurants in Queens with his wife, pulls up to said vacant house. And this part of the story makes me particularly queasy. According to investigators, 5 teenagers planned to rob the delivery driver when he arrived. Already not a great thought. But the situation escalated into murder. Police said Liu was beaten with a brick outside the vacant home. And I find that detail so incredibly haunting because it wasn't just one strike. There's one person who is charged for the final strike, but there were multiple strikes and multiple people hitting this man. One of the other details that kept appearing in the coverage of the case was that several $100s remained in Liu's pockets, and they didn't steal that. So they beat him to death with a brick and then just kind of ate the food. And I find that so incredibly chilling. The food order itself became the roadmap investigators used to reconstruct the crime. Police traced the order, the delivery address, and eventually the cell phone used to place the call. And that cell phone belonged to a 17-year-old, and suddenly the timeline got a lot tighter. Now investigators had an idea of when the call was made, when the food was prepared, when Liu left the restaurant, when he was sent, and who initiated the order. The food delivery creates an incredible amount of forensic timing information, especially before modern apps with GPS existed. Back before a lot of these very detailed apps could trace every move everybody makes, restaurants still had to log calls, they had to write down delivery addresses, the phone companies still had records. So while it was easier to disappear into those details, they still played a crucial role. In fact, when I was researching the crime to open this episode, it was way easier to find cases where Chinese food provided a really crucial detail in the timeline of events rather than it was like the anchoring piece of the crime itself. Despite watching a ton of true crime, it never occurred to me how much food deliveries would play an active role in solving crimes. Now, these people are douche canoes for what they did, so I'm not going to mention their names. I'm just going to call them person 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Person 1 was 14 at the time of the murder. That's right, 14. We're barely out of tween stage. This person received a sentence of 7 years to life and is on lifelong parole after being identified as the person to give the final strike, the fatal blow with that brick. The other 4 people received prison sentences ranging from 11 years to 17 years, which, if you like math, tells you that basically all of them are out of prison. Mind you, these were not children from disadvantaged homes. That was something that was called out in the articles. Reports describe them as coming from relatively stable and loving homes, which makes it even more disgusting that these are the choices that they made. This is what they thought was a good time. So now I'm kind of in a bad mood, right? And I'm like, I gotta know a little bit more about what came out of these situations. In the 1990s and early 2000s, food delivery work was considered one of the most dangerous service jobs in major cities. I didn't know that either. Drivers often carried cash, worked alone, delivered late at night, and routinely traveled to unfamiliar locations. The other thing that strikes me is like, they're probably also younger because they're trying to get money quickly. They don't need a lot of experience for this. Like, it never occurred to me how disadvantaged these people might be. But following cases like Liu's murder and several others involving delivery workers in New York, restaurants and advocacy groups pushed for additional safety measures. Early efforts focused on caller ID verification, address tracking, limiting cash carried by drivers, dispatch logs, and better communication systems. And over time, delivery work itself also changed dramatically. By the 2020s, app delivery services had transformed the industry. I mean, at this point, when I place an order, I can see every turn that the driver makes. I also know whether they're on a bike, I know whether they're on a motorcycle, a car. There's a lot of details. Does my murderino self always assume that it's a serial murderer behind the door? Yes, I do. So I always try to make sure to have an exit strategy just to cover all my bases. Okay, but back to worker advocacy groups like Los Deliveristas Unidos. Los Deliveristas Unidos. I can't make that sound better. Pushed for broader labor protections and safety regulations. New York later introduced measures involving minimum pay standards, safety equipment requirements, restroom access protections, something Amazon should really pay attention to, and regulations around delivery app practices. And now delivery work exists inside this massive digital tracking system. What does remain? A very detailed timeline that still gets used a lot for solving crime. But somewhere in the middle of this, fortune cookies still exist. And if you're wondering where the message comes from, they originally were written by hand, as I mentioned, and referenced anything from religious passages to something more personal. Later, companies like Wonton Food Inc. needed to kind of come up with a strategy to be able to scale, not have to just look in the Bible. So they started using large databases of sayings, predictions, jokes, and culturally recognizable phrases. Fun fact, there are some people who have won lotteries using the numbers on the back of messages. Percentage-wise, probably still the same as any old set of numbers, but still kind of cool to say that story. But the more I research, the more I notice patterns in how fear spreads through societies. Groups of people get blamed collectively. They lose homes, businesses, opportunities, years of their lives, and the effects ripple outward for generations. It doesn't seem to matter whether it's Japanese Americans during World War II, indigenous communities basically the last 500 years, the Black and Brown communities, the Irish, or people simply viewed as other. The pattern repeats itself constantly throughout history. Now listen, you gotta make your own decisions, but I'll just share how I make mine. I'm a big believer in trying to treat people in the community like I would want to be treated. I find it helps me see things a little more clearly. After all, you may not know what your fortune holds. And that's it for today's episode of True Crime Culinary. See you next week. Until next time, stay curious and be careful what's in your cup. Check out our show notes for sources, hit that subscribe button, rate and review the podcast anywhere you listen.